And so I am Jonas Kurlberg, if you didn't know that. I am currently a research fellow at the University of Roehampton in London, and I chair the Global Network for Digital Theology. I'm also one of the editors for the Oxford Handbook of Digital Theology, and my contribution to the handbook was reflecting on disability theology and digitality together with Nina. So yes, we are married, and we thought we'd bring together, I guess, two of our interests, and the chapter is a result of that. So I'm going to hand over to you, Nina.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. So I'm Nina. I'm currently a postdoctoral research associate at Durham Uni. And yeah, as Jonas said, we co-wrote this chapter together. So I'll start and say a little bit about it, and then I'll hand over to Jonas. So in this chapter, we're proposing really that discourses within disability theology can be brought into fruitful dialogue with reflections on human entanglement with technology in digital societies. So this connection between disability and technology in the popular imagination can be traced back to the rise of modern science and technology, when the dominant societal response to disability focused on people's ability to function, sort of aiming to fix what was considered to be defective through technological intervention. This type of approach, it's commonly referred to as the medical model of disability, and it's often critiqued on the basis that it sustains ideas of normalcy. And then in the late 20th century, there was an alternative way of conceptualizing disability, the social model that emerged from within the disability rights movement. And this model highlights that disability is a social construct. It's not impairment that disables people, but actually the barriers that exist within a society that caters to the norm and problematizes anything that deviates from this. So therefore, who is disabled is determined, largely determined by social norms, legislation, and technological innovation. So what we do in the chapter is we bring in a third model of disability that critiques and complements these, and that's the model that was developed by theologian Deborah Creamer, the limits model. And this model, it acknowledges and it emphasizes limits as part of shared human experience. So Creamer rejects the binarism and the negative valuations present within the medical and social models, and argues that limits are inherent to the human condition. To be human is to have limits. So Creamer's model challenges essentialist views of limits, and it enables both examination of the values behind our attitudes towards limits, and theological conversations about what it means to live with them. So there's a quote here on the screen from Deborah Creamer. So limits need not and perhaps ought not be seen as negative or as something that is not or cannot be done. So we draw on Creamer's model, and then we also draw on Elaine Graham, particularly her work on human imagination. So Graham sees human imagination as key to authentic living in the worlds that we create through technology. Drawing on Martin Heidegger, Heidegger's concept of indwelling, Graham suggests a relational framing of technological culture and artifacts that invites reflection on living within the horizons or measures of God's transcendence, the autonomy of creation, and human finitude. Allows us to consider what it means to live both with our limits and within and beyond the limits and possibilities created by our technological world. So in the chapter, we have sort of four sections, and now we'll just say a bit briefly about each of these sections. So the first relates to lived experience in online spaces. So much of the public debate surrounding the internet and disability continues to revolve around questions of accessibility predominantly. Some disability scholars argue that despite improvements, inaccessibility persists in an industry that's dominated by commercial interests and an ableist design mindset. Importantly, the category disability includes diverse conditions, and this means that people with these diverse conditions have very different experiences of digital engagement. So we argue in the chapter that a fuller understanding of the term inclusion is needed that doesn't begin with a normative body and end with access. And here we find the limits model really helpful. Limits can be viewed as boundaries which aren't abhorrent or abnormal in and of themselves, but can be compared and considered. So Creamer reframes the concept of limitation from being a negative trait of some individuals to a shared quality of human being. And what this does is it removes the power dynamics between the marginalized excluded and the powerful included. And then the starting point for inclusion becomes our shared limitedness. We argue in the chapter that while universal design goes some way towards addressing this, a cultural view of technology highlights the social impact that technology can have upon its users. So ultimately, users still have to conform to dominant practices within a normative centre. Technological design processes and innovations are driven by different, sometimes conflicting principles and interests, but in relation to most innovation, the bottom line is ultimately still profitability. So therefore, the dominant principle is that of persuasive technology, which seeks to influence users' thoughts and behaviour to certain, often financial ends. So I guess what we're arguing here is that discourses of accessibility in digital communications technology can mask other dynamics at play in digital societies.
That brings us to a second section, so where we're testing the limits model and in the concept of indwelling. I think we're all familiar with, all those of us who've been working in digital theology are familiar with the question of embodiment, which quickly surfaces when we start having these conversations. And here, disembodiment can be an accusation that theologians and church leaders have kind of routinely levied against online engagement. And so, for example, disability theologian Kenway claims that online engagement comes at a high price, namely the effective devaluation of the body. But as I think a lot of us agree with this, that these arguments ignore the bodily actions and the bodies required for engagement online. We cannot be online without our bodies, whether touch, sight, or hearing. So we suggest that maybe a better way of speaking about it is different embodied experience that digital engagement entails. And that's not to say that the internet or digital media cannot be criticized for their potential negative impact on the human body and embodiment. But maybe that disembodiment is the wrong category to apply when we have this conversation. And so what we do often see is that there's assumption that the bodily practices that happens offline are normative and the standard by which those that happen online are judged. But one thing that we argue that we saw through the pandemic is that, people with disabilities have been meeting online for decades for worship, for Bible study, prayer, and fellowship, and so on. In some ways, what it does is that it does throw back a question about how accessible are our offline embodied gatherings, where a lot of people with disabilities who are homebound are not able to participate altogether. The more accessibility of online worship then puts a spotlight on the inaccessibility of many church buildings for people with disabilities, despite investments that are made over the previous decades. Accessibility and inclusion of people with disabilities remained an argument for proponents of digital church. But returning to the limits model, it challenges then the uniformity of bodily practices implied in these theologies that hold that online engagement is disembodied. Just as the embodiment of people with disabilities challenges notions of the normative body, so digital practices challenges traditional ecclesial practices. The gathering to worship in church building is often seen as the norm and basis on which all other practices are to be judged. Yet what we learn from the embodied practices of persons with disabilities is the broad plurality of embodiment of human experiences. And then a third area where we bring these kind of conversations to, it has to do with the human body and technology. And we could argue, that actually the human body humans have been inseparable from their technologies. as far as we can remember, or as far as human history goes back. But in late modern societies, this kind of connectedness between the body, human body, and technologies become more obvious and more visible as this kind of blending between the biological bodies and mechanics grows more visible. So we have explored two dominant narratives in relation to this interconnection. And the one concerns transhumanism, which sees the possibilities, valorizes the possibility of enhancing the human body, making it better, more agile, more bright, more able, greater possibilities through technology. Arguably, those discourses are underpinned by an enlightenment myth of progress, so that we, as human beings, we're constantly progressing to something better and greater. And it comes also with its own anthropological assumptions that then also influences human self-understanding, as well, I think, as perception of disabilities. The correlation between the medical model of disability that Nina discussed, which essentially says that disability is a medical problem that we can then overcome, we need to overcome by medical intervention or even technology. The correlation there between that disability model and discourses of technological enhancement, transhumanism, it becomes clear because both operate to a similar logic. And it's based on an anthropology that assumes a mechanistic view of the body, that we are basically machines that can be fixed and amended and improved. And under this logic, disability is a technical problem that requires a technological solution. And enhancement is just a further step in this logic. If the human body is machine-like, it can only not just be fixed, but also be improved and upgraded. Theologians have reacted to transhumanist visions in different ways, and we argue that there is within Christian theology a sense of transcendence and human transcendence, but it's a different kind of narrative of what perfection looks like and what the end goals is. So in Christian theology, it's a move towards deification or godlikeness. But we can't deny that we can't deny that actually our engagement with technology does have impact on our bodies as well. But with reference to disability theology, such a vision can also be contrasted then with Nancy Iceland's metaphor of the disabled God, which suggests that the post-resurrected body of Christ indeed celebrates the body. And the disabled God also points towards a different vision of perfection than that of transhumanism. The second narrative that we engage with is critical posthumanism. And here the cyborg figure has become a kind of a metaphor, a symbol for this particular view. And it's an alternative interpretation of what happens when the human body and technology are intertwined. So according to Donna Haraway, the cyborg is a product of the fusion of the human biological body with technology, but we can't speak of this as enhancement because we can't know what the actual outcome of that and bringing together of technology and human body, what outcome is. We can't fully predict what will happen in that fusion. So instead, the cyborg creates a new category of being, undermines essentialist anthropologies. And in some ways, the cyborg opens a place for people with disabilities in ways that the transhumanist vision cannot, because of the plurality that it assumes. And under the logic of transhumanism, the disabled body is deficient and inadequate, whereas for the cyborg, bodily differences are accepted as given outcomes of this hybridization of technology and human. So in the process of cyborgification, distinction between disabled and normal are eradicated and blurred. And while technology has been used to enable persons with disabilities to more readily fit the norm, which we argue is not necessarily negative, but through adopting technology, they actually become a different kind of being, a new category, a new identity. So someone with a prosthetic limb is in some way more normal because they can walk, but they also emerge with a new identity because of this prosthetic attachment. So for the cyborg, there can't be any normacy. And in this respect, the cyborg finds affinity with social model of disability, which in the face of normacy paradigm highlights the diversity of human bodies. But to point out that identity markers are porous and unstable is different from saying that humans have limits. So Cyborg reminds us that regardless of positive technological enhancement, human limitedness persists. Technological artifacts create new affordances and possibilities, but also curtails others. For example, a cochlear implant can improve hearing capabilities, but might at the same time change the social location of the individual within a deaf community.
And then we have our fourth section, which is about human vulnerability and limits in the encounter with a technological other. So we learn something of the human condition through our encounter with the machines that we create, and therefore anthropology features prominently in philosophical, ethical, and theological explorations of technology. The need for such reflection actually has only increased in recent years with the rise of AI and particularly the personification of technology. Human uniqueness is also a central theme in theological anthropology, which has historically tended to pinpoint rationality as a distinguishing trait of humankind and reflection of the Imago Dei. So more recently, such views have come under scrutiny, including by disability theologians who, in particular, sort of look at this issue of the Imago Dei or the topic of the Imago Dei, but in relation to intellectual disabilities or those living with profound intellectual disabilities. And they emphasize that actually, in thinking about the Imago Dei, it's the relationality that's the distinguishing trait. Locating human uniqueness in rationality has also become trickier in light of the increasing intelligence of AI, which can surpass human intelligence. So theologian Marius Dorobantu argues that human intelligence is different from that of machine learning. AI calculates its inferences statistically, and while humans also learn from our experience, our intelligence is intuitive and relational instead. This predisposes us to biases and irrationality, but it's also here that some of the most human experiences are found. So examples here would be love or acts of self-sacrifice. So it's therefore in our cognitive vulnerability, argues Dorobantu, or propensity for the irrational vis-a-vis the machine, that our humanness can be theologically located. Dorobantu's argument is comparable, we argue, with Creamer's conceptualization of limits. The cognitive limitations of humans in the face of the technological other do not have to be seen as defective or even unwanted. While Creamer takes an essentially neutral stance towards limits, however, Dorobantu is valorizing them. But we see that there's some comparability there between the two arguments. For Graham, human uniqueness is located in the ability to create new worlds and the imagination to indwell them. On the surface, such a notion seems to suggest the very capacity-based anthropology that disability theologians reject. But Graham argues that a prerequisite for finding our place within the worlds that we create through technology is the acknowledgement of our finitude. This points towards our hybridized interdependence and the interconnectedness of one another, the divine and non-human creatures. Living authentically within technological worlds, then, is both an individual and a communal endeavor. Human cognition in all its forms points towards something that's beyond the rationality employed by the machine. It's a cognition that's poetic, metaphysical, and even transcendent, that cannot simply be coded into the repeatable patterns of efficient machines. It's not in our aspiration for limitlessness that human flourishing can be found, but in our living in light of limits. Sorry, you're on mute, Jonas.
Yes,
Like,
I just recognized that there was some noise in the background here. So what we try to do is to show the value of Creamer's limits model of disability, using it as a framework to help us reflect on our attitude towards specific limits and how to live with technology accordingly. In technological societies, limits are seen as something that we need to overcome, where technologies themselves are used to overcome limits. And the limits model forces us to think about our own bodily limits as inevitable. We can then, with more clarity, ask which ones of our limits that we want to overcome and which we just simply accept. And what a theology of disability offers to the world of tech is a perspective that moves beyond fixing and mending. It recognizes that wholeness is social, mental, material, and spiritual. And in this regard, Graham's use of indwelling is fruitful, since it enables us to envision what such living involves. We can then start a process of indwelling digital environments as we seek to inhabit such spaces to fit our very beings, our needs, our desires, in harmony with the horizons of our existence and our finitude. For such practices to be of imagination, to be understood as Christians, they require an eschatological orientation. This necessitates an eschatological thrust that seek to manifest the new creation inaugurated through Jesus' resurrection. Christology is less pronounced in Graham's framework, yet for indwelling to have a Christian orientation, it implies a making and remaking of worlds by a community living in the shadow of the cross, in active anticipation of the eschaton. Such a posture suggests humility, which moves us away from exploitation towards mutuality. And it's through our finitude, consequent vulnerability, and recognition of interdependence that we are able to indwell the worlds that we create. So that is a quick overview and summary of our chapter. Just briefly, I want to mention a few ways that we think that this research could be expanded. What we were trying to do was to show really why this is an interesting question to begin with. We use the image of the symbol of disability is often a figure in a wheelchair. So it suggests that we intuitively think of a strong connection between disability and technology, at least widely in our societies. So to explore this further through a theological lens seemed to be interesting. And I think there's lots more work that could be done. Obviously, there are different ways to frame the conversation. We've done it through one way. There are opportunities, I think, to do empirical research, practical theology research around the lived experiences of people with disabilities and technology. And yeah, particularly now with questions of AI and how that affects the lived experiences of people. There are some more recent publications as well. To be honest, I haven't found loads. So there is a gap there for further research for other people to take up.